As you're aware, we've been looking at the duties required in the first commandment for the last several months from question 104 of the larger catechism. The phrase for today from the catechism is this: the duties required in the first commandment are yielding all obedience and submission to him with the whole man. There are actually 3 points to this phrase: obedience, submission, and whole man. We are to obey God, we are to submit to him, and we are to do so with the whole man, with our entire selves, with every fiber of our being. The proof text for obedience is Jeremiah 7:23. But this is what I commanded them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well with you. This verse comes from a section in Jeremiah where the prophet is standing at the gate of the Lord's house, proclaiming the word of the Lord to the people of Judah. In other words, Jeremiah is talking to God's people as they are coming to worship. He is speaking to God's people, not foreigners, not Gentiles. And what does he say? If we were to look at the whole passage, we'd see that in verse 3, he says, to amend your ways. In verse 4, he says, do not oppress the stranger, the fatherless, or the widow. In verse 7, he promises that he will dwell with them in this place, the temple. But how do the people respond? In verse 8, they trust in lying words. In verse 9, they steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, and walk after other gods. In other words, the people, God's people, are violating God's law. They are regularly disobeying the 8th, the 6th, the 7th, the 9th, and the first commandments. But it's okay because they are going to God's temple. They are committing the classic fallacy of sinning on Saturday and confessing on Sunday. But we are to obey God. We are to obey his voice by following his law. Next, having no other gods before Yahweh, before the Lord, means submitting to him. The proof text for this is James 4:7. Therefore, submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Submitting to God means fleeing from Satan, resisting his temptations. No one can serve two masters, Jesus said, for he will love one and hate the other. According to this part of Scripture, submitting to God means drawing near to him, having clean hands and a purified heart. This comes in a passage where James says, you lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. He even refers to his readers, to God's people, as adulterers and adulteresses. Like Jeremiah, James does not mince words. God says his people are murderers and adulterers. And like the passage that we just discussed on obedience, lack of submission to God means violating his moral law. And what does the passage say our response is to be? We are to lament and mourn and weep. Our laughter should be turned to mourning and our joy to gloom. Finally, obeying the first commandment means obeying and submitting with the whole man. Again from James, this time chapter 2, verse 10, we read, for whoever shall keep the whole law and yet stumbles in one point, he is guilty of all. It's not enough to keep 9 of the 10 commandments. All 10 are required. And this verse comes in a passage of Scripture where God admonishes his people not to show partiality to the wealthy. We are not to favor the rich, the powerful, or the well-connected. Disobeying this point makes one guilty of the entire law. This shows how broad God's law is. Showing partiality is just as bad as murder. I remind you that none of these passages of Scripture are written to foreigners, to those outside of God's covenant. These passages are written to God's people. They are written to us. It's as if Jeremiah is standing outside this door saying, "Thus saith the Lord." If, like me, you feel the need to cower before these words, then Scripture has done its work. We serve a most holy God. We cannot worship this holy God and not be reminded of our sin. We should mourn and weep and lament. We must confess our sin before God, the God with whom we have to do. I invite you to kneel with me, confessing your personal sin privately and then corporately as it's written in the bulletin.